Were my eyes deceiving me? It was, after all, very easy to be deceived on planet Earth. Deception, misdirection, illusions, and subliminals bombarded the senses from every conceivable direction. The only way to see beyond the smoke and mirrors of creation was to connect with one's real awareness, and thus we were less likely to be hoodwinked. I rubbed my eyes, took another look. Seems it wasn't an illusion or my imagination. Lindsay had returned. I was delighted to see her as I ushered her into the house. She had stated her intention to return, that she wanted to hear further dreams and experiences, and although my parents and I were very willing to share them, we were equally as surprised that Lindsay had actually turned up. The biscuits were unleashed. Strong cups of tea distributed. Gwen, Peter, Lindsay, and I seated ourselves. I even had ensured that there were enough custard cream biscuits for us all. It was all in the preparation, and Lindsay settled in for more harrowing and exciting stories of our dream escapades. And so I began. I was in an observing capacity, objectively viewing, you might say, a front row seat to the drama that then unfolded. The setting reminded me of Lord of the Rings, or perhaps Game of Thrones, a Middle Ages theme. Swords, knights, and magic. A military camp had been seized by an evil sorceress and her ilk. The soldiers that had been stationed at this camp were now bound and rendered helpless by this sorceress's guards. The objective of all this, the focus of the sorceress, was on a young individual, a young man who had in his possession a mysterious artifact. She demanded that he surrender it to her. He was reluctant to do so. Just then another individual of a magical persuasion entered the camp. This one, however, was a self-proclaimed good magician, what we might call a white magician, as opposed to the evil of the sorceress. His purpose here was to prevent the evil sorceress from acquiring the artifact. He felt it was wiser that he have the keeping of it, and thus demanded it from the young man. The good magician believed he was better suited to keep the artifact safe from those who would use its powers for ill purposes. While this interaction was going on, the bound soldiers escaped their shackles. They slew the guards of the sorceress and promptly fled the camp, seemingly uninterested in the artifact and to whose hands it would fall into. The young possessor of the artifact would now find himself trapped in a bubble. Evil snakes were slithering towards him. The snakes were under the control of the sorceress, but help would come in the form of another serpent, a large white snake with multiple heads that the white magician had sent forth to protect the young man. The bubble would then dissolve as the man emerged and was confronted by the sorceress and the white magician, both requesting the artifact. He refused them both, and used the power of the artifact to transport himself to a safe location. His destination was apparently a place called Luca. Just before departure, a companion of his joined him, a curious being with the body of a human, yet the head of a horse. And with them both clinging to the artifact, they shot off into the sky, presumably to Luca, and the sorceress and the white magician were denied. Lindsay was clearly captivated by the dream, and enthusiastically requested an explanation, as she was understanding now that dreams are demonstrations, and contain valuable learnings and experiences for one's awareness to blossom. I first pointed out the two magicians, one white and one black. Regardless of the magic they used and for what ends, both would be the effects of their sorcery. Through their choices and decisions, they must have reached the ethereal life level, the vehicle of which is the seat of such psychic and magical phenomena. And, regardless of if the magic is used for ill or good, they still will rack up karmic cause and effect consequences, as this is the dualistic nature of creation, the opposites, and the trap of the matrix. In the dream, the bubble certainly can be said to be representing creation, and the two different snakes, the duality within the bubble of the creation psych realms. The young man, then, was representing choice number 3, as when individuals reach the ethereal, the choice between black or white magician is presented, but always there is a third option, that of superseding the ethereal and going forth into the real universes of the is. In the dream, Luca represented the third option, bypassing the final test of the ethereal level. So, you might say, this dream is a reminder, a heads up or a warning, that as I continue with my process, I may some day too be faced with this final test, the choice between black or white magician or the real universes. And the fact I was viewing this dream objectively, this would represent the view I would have from a place of full awareness. The amulet also represents an idea, and as you look at the governments of the world, they appear to be good too, the marketing front, but they take everything you have and set you up. They play both sides. The amulet represents the idea of denying individuals possession of what I have. In other words, they are looking for agreement. The amulet represents agreement, and the agreement was declined, so the adventure continues. So, it's not about good or bad, it's about awareness, objectively perceiving, to be aware of the nature of creation, the deceptors, the influence, and the supreme deceptor. I snatched the TV remote control from Gwen's grasp. This was no time for subliminal programming, and despite her contention that she simply wanted to determine the weather, I didn't want the tendrils of mind-bending electromagnetism to impact my cranium, at least until the dream recounting was complete. I replaced the remote controller with an apple, Probably genetically altered and toxic too, but wasn't everything in this world. I continued with further real-side dream experiences. The dream would begin with a chase. My group and I were fleeing from an assortment of animals that clearly didn't have our best interests at heart. A mercifully brief chase. We were able to escape them with ease, but then things would take a peculiar turn. I was now the subject of a kind of experiment, the purpose of which was to transform me into a bird. Not the worst thing to be turned into, I suppose, but I didn't relish the idea of eating worms. It seemed, though, I was destined to become a considerably larger bird than usual. A series of steps in a process that culminated in a leap of faith. The final stage of this process required me to leap from a high mountain, and apparently the transformation then would occur. I did just this. The transition occurred, and a large bird I became, soaring and swooping in the sky, very exhilarating indeed. The experiment was to repeat. I was now back in human form, only this time it was more technologically dependent. Whole laboratories with a team of scientists working in tandem to recreate the original results. Except the bird I would become was going to be of a far greater size. The experiment proved a success. My feathered, fluttering self filled the laboratory and caused great alarm amongst the scientists. Several of the scientists stepped forward and began blasting at me with firearms. Seems the result of the work was not to their liking. At this point, however, my objective view was established, rather than being immersed in the scene, as I was in the beginning of this dream. The huge bird suffered great damage, then was bundled into a kind of constricted confinement, a capsule of some kind, which was then jettisoned into space. And it is there that the poor unfortunate oversized bird would live out its days. Lindsay asked a little sheepishly if the initial pursuing animals were controllers. I was delighted at her understanding. Seems she was paying attention after all. Maybe there was something in those custard cream biscuits. Maybe they were awareness-enhancing biscuits. Anything was possible in creation. And yes, it was most likely the animals were disgruntled controllers, or creatures sent by them, always hot on our heels, and pestering anyone who tries to free their shackles. Changing initially into a bird was maybe demonstrating my escape from their clutches and ill intentions, and reaching a level beyond which their awareness would not permit them to follow. The second replication of the experiment may be the dark forces trying to reach the real universes through technological means. Knowledge then of the real universes, but not choosing to attain them through becoming aware enough to perceive them, but through literal means, the technology representing this, and a means doomed to failure. A possible glimpse then into some of the things the controllers are occupying themselves with, maybe the results of which were disastrous, and had to be shut down and contained, the bird shot off into space. In the beginning, the leap of faith could be considered as taking the risk. And when you take the risk, you will fly. The bird magnified in its scale through awareness, with the controllers trying to control it, but were unable to. They have the ideas, but not the view, trying to replicate the awareness, but unable to perceive it. The controllers generally want power and control to ruin others, to be on the top of the heap, demonstrated by the mad scientists. They had the carcass, but not the awareness. Having been deprived from her mobile phone for the duration it had taken for the dream telling up to this point, Lindsay would then activate it and do all the essential phone-related things that simply had to be done. I could barely recall the world before the advent of these pesky little devices, but while she was tapping away on the mind-warping, electromagnetic distorting gadget, it reminded me of another dream. A robot dream, in fact. As we were fastly heading into such a reality, and the mobile phones were just the beginning, an addiction to technology that would lead us ultimately to becoming walking, talking technology. As I had Lindsay's attention once more, and a few essential selfies of her eating a biscuit had been sent to every corner of cyberspace, it was time to resume. Just like the dream I mentioned last time, the one where I was attempting to spy on the reptilians, this is another infiltration dream, only this time the targets were robots. These particular robots were certainly unique in their appearances. I might say very poorly constructed robots, sort of cyborgs, in fact. They were a hickledy-pickledy, hodgepodge mismatch of human organic and mechanical parts, not very aesthetically pleasing to the eye. The majority had human heads, but very malformed, infused with metal, with unhealthy pallors to the skin, like waxy cheese. I was with another group. I felt that these were the guides, and they had assigned me this infiltrate and gather information mission, which I readily accepted. An extra feature of this spying mission was that they considered it more prudent that I go in the form of a female. These were male robots, and even though robotized, their sexual natures and desires were still very present. Their emotional bodies were certainly not suppressed, and so they were of a thrill-seeking variety, as most humans are. They would be too busy drooling over my form, or leaking oil perhaps, than to consider and become suspicious as to my presence and motives there. The final touch was the addition of some curious pyramid-like marks to my arm, and I was assured that these would further ensure my safety. So I entered what appeared to be a tavern, a robotic drinking establishment. The robots within were a rowdy, bothersome group indeed. My spying attempt ended the moment I entered the tavern, despite my distracting form and the marks of protection, and I was chased from it. The scene switched momentarily to my being in a room with another individual, who was a member of my initial group, and a television which featured a rerun of the events that had just transpired. It occurred to me this was in many ways similar to what Dwayne described in his new books as the future view, watching various events and scenes from the past on a kind of television, up to the point where I was about to be robot jam. The attempts to escape proving futile, the view stopped and rerun to the point where I had just emerged from the tavern with the disgruntled robots in pursuit. Only on the second replay I was transformed into a robot myself, for the purposes of being more readily able to defend myself, and I did so effectively. The real me was doing what was necessary to afford protection, in this case robotization, to meet the threat of the other robots. Lindsay chortled. She pointed out how awful I was at espionage, and that I would make the world's worst James Bond. It was true that this did seem to be the case, so I conceded that maybe it's because I like being discovered, as it adds a degree of extra excitement to the dream. And besides, the guides always are close at hand, and perhaps they are accommodating dreams of this nature, that I can further become adept at handling these situations. I'm fairly certain they must realise what is going to unfold, and my guises will not fall those I intend to spy on. And so, chases and badly made pizzas will be the result, but I must be aware not to get too emotionally embroiled in the thrill of the dreams. What is more important is the awareness expanding demonstrations and experiences the dreams provide. Lindsay would remark how once again I was bothering people, in this case robots. Yes, I'm getting their attention in different and fun ways. The guides are prompting me and encouraging me in this regard, I replied. It was time for one final dream. I considered what it might be. Shall I regale her with the one about the castle in the sky, lorded over by terrifying dragons? Perhaps the one where some little gnomes, who are evidently not the greatest mechanics ever, ruined my car. Instead, I settled for the Book of Distorted Faces, aptly named, as I would now reveal. I found myself in the presence of a group of people, and for a change, they were not a group that I was affiliated with, and whom I would normally share adventures and missions of danger and untold perils. They had in their possession a strange book. Always the curious individual, I attempted to glean a peek at the book's contents, and they deftly snatched it away, disallowing me to see whatever the book contained. I was very persistent, trying to get glimpses of whatever it was that was so secret I wasn't permitted to see. They rather gruffly informed me that the book had pictures of individuals who had failed in recognizing their real awareness in this current lifetime, and that I should avert my eyes. I pestered them still further, and rather reluctantly they allowed me to see. The individuals depicted in this book were a frightful bunch indeed. The faces were distorted. They had elongated jaws, gaping mouths, with frozen O's of terror. Certainly a shudder or two crept the length of my spine and back, and I would awake with the dream very vivid in my mind. But it was not over yet. One of the distorted, creepy-faced individuals had followed me from the real side to physical reality. I wouldn't say that I could perceive him with my physical eyes, more an awareness of his unnerving presence, and made more apparent by the fact that he was nipping and gnawing on my leg, and I certainly was feeling that. Amazingly, I was feeling drowsy. I could feel sleep washing over me, threatening to pull me back under. I determined, under the circumstances, this wasn't the best thing to happen, so I fought off my want to fall asleep, became fully awakened, and the leg-biting individual faded away. Lindsay was clearly fascinated. She wanted to know more about this book. It's the book of Who's Who, I would respond. Looking quizzically at me, I would further explain to her. It was most likely a book of political and self-important controllers from around the world. And so, they may look grand and proper on the physical, with their expensive suits and ties to match, but on the real side, they appeared how they are, distorted. Lindsay wanted to know what was up with the one who chased me, so I said, I must have recognized this particular individual, this distorted being in the book, and who he is on the physical, and he wasn't very pleased at my knowledge of his identity, so he came after me. We are spied upon every moment. They are keeping tabs on us, and determining those who are revealing their secrets, and unveiling the hidden puppet masters. We are more aware of what's happening in the world, and so we can expect to be constantly bothered by those that prefer people to be unconscious slaves. Lindsay wasn't very impressed at the means by which I was attacked. She wanted to know if they had ray guns and more sophisticated weaponry. Biting people did seem rather lame, but that just more so revealed that our esteemed controllers are not as sophisticated and divine as they might have us believe. Settling back in my chair, it was apparent my dream-telling was done for today. All attention was now on Peter. It was time for him to talk.
A few nights ago, I had the most amazing and exciting dream I can ever remember. It started off unremarkably enough. I appeared to be in some kind of big basement with numerous others milling about. I did not see their faces nor hear them speak. It was fairly dark, but I could see at least 2 sets of stone stairs of maybe 10 or more steps leading up to doorways to the outside. People, including me, were occasionally going up one or other set of stairs, looking out and coming back down again. When I looked out, it was a beautiful sunny day, and there appeared to be an area of grass leading out to some nearby hilly area. There was a general feeling of apprehension in the basement. Some enemy or malevolent group were anticipated and expected to appear over the nearest hill at any time. Then I was standing still in the basement, confronted by a large trap door. It was not solid, but rather resembled a single old-fashioned bedstead, but with a mass of criss-crossing wires rather than springs. 2 men in front of me pushed it upwards and exited, so I followed suit, out into the glorious sunshine, with no longer any thoughts of menace approaching. Arguably what happened next was a different dream, but there was no obvious break, and it seemed to just follow seamlessly on. It was, however, now dark, and I was up in the air, flying above some small town or village centre. I was quite high up, but could see lots of human activity down below, so I assumed it was a winter's late afternoon or evening, though I had no impression of it being cold. For the next few minutes of the dream at least, I found I could decide what to do and where to go, rather than just going with the flow of the dream. I think this probably makes this part of the events at least a lucid dream. Either way, I decided to dive down to just above the people's heads, but nobody seemed to see me. I then soared upwards and spent a certain amount of time shooting away in different directions, dive bombing and hurtling upwards, hither and thither, like an out-of-control UFO, although I was perfectly in control and loving every minute of it. I had had the odd flying dreams over the years, but nothing like as exciting or as long as this one. Also, everything seemed so vivid and clearer than normal dreams, like comparing HD with normal TV. I found myself away from the town centre and flying up a residential street. The only person around me was a little old lady walking along. In a moment of devilment, I dived down and dropped onto the pavement, the sidewalk that is, behind her. No reaction. I gently pushed her back. Still nothing. I felt no contact either, so I got the impression we were not in the same plane of existence, which would explain why nobody else seemed to be able to see me earlier. I zoomed back up into the sky and continued my roller coaster activity. Suddenly I found I was flying up a long, dimly lit corridor in a long building, possibly a school. At the end of the corridor, in the doorway, I recognised Dwayne, as he appears on the front of his book 7 in a blue suit. Behind him stood 2 or 3 figures. They were rather in the shadow, so I could not make out any features, although I felt they were all male. I dropped down on the floor in front of him. He smiled at me and made some encouraging remark, which I could not recall on waking up later on. We bid each other goodbye and I flew off. Back up the corridor and out, up into the sky once more. Hovering for a moment and considering where to go next, I was suddenly aware of Kevin hovering next to me. He said something about there being something of interest to see at the railroad station, so we set off for it and I woke up. I peered at the clock. It was about 3 a.m. I was in a state of total euphoria and could not get over the exhilaration and excitement I had just experienced. I told myself, "You've just visited the real side, old son," an impression that was later to be refuted by those more in the know. That could, however, not take away that wonderful experience, and Dwayne told me it was the real guides effectively giving me a booster. He added that the first part of the dream signified my rising above the physical and in effect moving into a higher level. Lindsay then said, "Have you met any of the real guides?" I answered, not knowingly at the time, but the most of my life I have felt at odd times I was not alone when physically I was, and I've always felt very looked after by the unknown, for want of a better word. Many times in my adult life, in particular at crisis points, somebody or something has always come to the rescue, like the cavalry, sometimes quite spectacularly. I had long put it down to my spirit guides, my deceased father, your grandpa, and the universe generally, but while certainly not discounting these, since Kevin introduced me to the new UU folk, I tend to assume it is the real guides at work. Why they should feel I am worth spending such time, I have no idea, but I am eternally grateful. Some dreams I have had figures in them that Dwayne has said are most likely the real guides. I had 2 very short dreams recently where my grandpa was present, your grandpa's dad. I hadn't knowingly seen him in dreams or otherwise since he died in 1967, so it was odd to suddenly see him exactly as I always remembered him, twice in succession. In the first dream we were standing together facing each other in this very room. Then I went out and closed the door behind me. Something made me open it again, and he was still standing there just looking at me deadpan, and the dream ended. In life, I always remember him with a smile on his face, so it seemed odd. The second dream took place in Nana and Grandpa's back room downstairs. I was standing there watching your and my grandpa talking to each other. Unlike the first dream, where my grandpa was dressed pretty much as I always remember him, in rather old grey jacket and trousers, with his old pocket watch chain poking out of his waistcoat pocket, He was very smart indeed, in a bright blue three-piece suit. He asked your grandpa whether he had any books by a philosopher. Most improbable, with the best will in the world. And the dream ended. It took Dwayne to point out that the blue suit sounded like the ones he and the guides can be seen wearing on the covers of the new UU books, etc. And he believed my grandpa in the dreams was actually one of the real guides in disguise, in effect willing me to come up with my own dream interpretations rather than continuing to leave it to Dwayne. Lindsay was just about to speak again when her baby son Jack, who had been asleep up to now, started to come back and immediately regain his position at centre of attention, with the remark by me that, unlike Prince Charles, it looks like it's coming on to rain. Proceedings were effectively adjourned for another day.